Good afternoon, everyone. I am Catherine Brookman, Associate Director, Knowledge Transfer and Exchange, and on behalf of Dr. Jack Callahan, Director of the Center of Research Expertise for the Prevention of Musculoskeletal Disorders, or CRE-MSD as we are more commonly known, we'd like to thank you for joining us today for this free webinar on expanding the bounds of seated virtual workspaces. This is the third webinar in a series of 5 webinars on supporting remote office work, pivoting back to the workplace during a pandemic, and the future of virtual workspaces. We would like to acknowledge and thank our health and safety system partners who support and collaborated with us on this series, specifically today from Public Services Health and Safety Association, Patricia Clausen, Infrastructure Health and Safety Association, Peter Vai, Workplace Safety and Prevention Services, Don Patton, and Andrew Flanagan from Occupational Health Clinics of Ontario Workers. We are grateful to the Ministry of Labour, Training and Skills Development for our funding, which supports the delivery of these webinars, and to our presenters who provide their expertise. We ask that you keep yourself muted for the duration of the webinar as a courtesy to the presenter and all participants. During the question and answer period, we ask that you type your questions into the chat box. The chat box can be pulled up on your screen by selecting the chat icon in the control panel that appears near the bottom of your screen. I will relay these questions to the presenter or a similar question should we have duplicate themes. Should you have a pressing question or issue, such as a technology glitch that cannot wait until the end of the presentation, please type this into the chat box and we will do our best to address it right away. The format of today's webinar is as follows. The presentation will be given, after which time we will have 10 to 15 minutes for a question and answer period with our presenter. This webinar will be recorded, with the recording being made available to you on our website along with the presenter slides shortly after today's webinar. After the webinar, you will be sent a link to an evaluation. Please fill out this evaluation as it will assist us in the future delivery of our webinars. Thank you so much for joining us today, and remember to watch the CRE-MSD website and the MSD prevention site for new resources and events. Our next webinar in this series will be on November 17th at 4 p.m. rather than our typical 12 to 1, entitled A New Way Forward for the Prevention and Management of Discomfort in Office Personnel. Learnings from across the globe. Now it's my pleasure to introduce you to our presenter, Dr. Mark McGill. Dr. Mark McGill is an early career lecturer in human-computer interaction in the School of Computing Science at the University of Glasgow, Scotland, United Kingdom. His research interests revolve around the future impact of everyday augmented virtual and mixed reality technology, focusing on their potential to transform passenger experiences, their ability to augment and fundamentally alter our personal private workspaces and peripherals, as well as the ethical and privacy challenges posed by the anticipated mass adoption of these technologies. This is part of a 5-year European Research Council project. Now over to you, Mark, for this exciting presentation.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Can I just check you hear me okay?
You sound great.
Great. Thanks very much. Thanks everyone, and thanks particular to CRE-MSD, Catherine, Bettina, and Jack for giving me this opportunity to talk about some of my research today. So hello from a very rainy Glasgow in Scotland. It's a rather gloomy evening now, but nonetheless. So a bit of background about myself firstly. I'm a lecturer at the University of Glasgow, as Catherine said there, and I've been conducting research into human-computer interaction and mixed reality for the last 8 years or so as part of my PhD, and then as an RA, RF, and now lecturer at Glasgow. And today's talk will cover a few topics in my research. So firstly, I'll give a bit of a primer on what mixed virtual and augmented reality mean and the kinds of headsets that these experiences are enacted on. So apologies if any of you are experts on VR or AR, but nonetheless. And then I'll go over some of the benefits of virtual and augmented reality for creating more ergonomic and usable virtual workspaces. And then finally, I'll discuss work related to our European project on passenger mixed reality. So looking at how virtual and augmented reality might significantly alter passenger experiences and productivity for remote and mobile work. Now, I should say that human factors and ergonomics wasn't the domain of my PhD or such, but as I've grown familiar with the capabilities of AR and VR technology, I've started to more deeply explore how these technologies might affect everyday seated productivity. And that's what kind of influences some of these topics today. So firstly, I'll try and explain what mixed reality is and some of the common terms we need to be able to use to discuss content in mixed reality. And again, apologies if you're familiar with this, but just in case. So mixed reality refers to the intermixing of real and virtual content combined with sensing and tracking technology that can create a perceptual illusion that the virtual content appears real and embedded in 3D space. And mixed reality encompasses what we term both virtual and augmented reality. So you can see this continuum here on the display. Virtual reality is at the far right-hand side. It is exactly what it sounds like. It is a computer-generated reality you'd be inhabiting. On the other end of the spectrum, we have reality. In between is what we would describe as mixed reality. Augmented reality is where we are predominantly rooted in reality, but there are some virtual elements integrated there. And augmented virtuality is where we are predominantly rooted in virtual reality with some real world elements there. And mixed reality, as I said, encompasses both VR and AR. These technologies are effectively just altering this ratio of real to virtual content. Now, headset-based virtual reality is most popular these days. So particularly thanks to efforts from Oculus, Microsoft, HTC, Google, and others in creating more relatively affordable VR headsets, such as the Oculus Quest 2 here pictured. And such headsets are particularly well suited for gaming, training, and simulations. And this is because they largely occlude our perception of reality, instead creating an immersive sense of presence in a virtual world. But augmented reality for me is the real endpoint of consumer mixed reality. So in this clip, we see a seamless intermixing of both real and virtual content with see-through headsets such as Microsoft's HoloLens 2 here, showing that we're inching ever closer to augmented reality becoming a feasible option for business and consumers. And the eventual endpoint here is really everyday wearable AR devices. So devices that resemble something like a pair of glasses. So on the left here, we can see the Nreal AR headset. On the right, we can see Facebook's Project Aria, an exemplar of packing augmented reality related sensing into a glasses form factor. And the adoption and prevalence of such devices will lead to a significant change in personal computing. So I particularly like this quote here. It says, "We won't be able to opt out from wearing AR glasses in 2035 any more than we can opt out of owning smartphones today." So augmented reality glasses will supplement and eventually supplant existing displays and devices in favor of rendering virtual spatial content around the user. Now, in order to accomplish this, crucially, mixed reality headsets are typically capable of what we call inside-out tracking. So this is where cameras and sensors on these devices can track features in the environment to determine where the device sits in reality, typically to a sub-centimeter accuracy. So this allows for both orientation and position tracking, which is typically referred to as 6DoF or 6 degrees of freedom. So if you've ever used a VR headset, such as an Oculus Quest, you've experienced this. You look through the VR headset, you move around in a room scale environment like your living room, and you'll see that the view in the VR headset updates accordingly. Now, there's also a bit of terminology that's useful to know here when describing mixed reality devices and experiences. And that is the different ways in which we can position virtual content relative to our device. So virtual content can be described as belonging to a reference frame. which describes the location of the virtual objects in the reward space. So effectively the coordinate space that the virtual content is placed within. And there are two reference frames to note, egocentric and exocentric. So egocentric describes an object's location with respect to the perceiver's perspective. As you can see here in this clip, the user is walking forward. The display remains locked to their head in the same distance and position relative to their body. And then exocentric describes an object's location independently of the perceiver's perspective or location. So in this clip here, you can see the exocentric display is fixed in the world. The mixed reality user is walking past it. So a little bit of detail about the egocentric one. So egocentric display content can be locked to the view of the head, the body, or the hand, but basically it's content that's fixed relative to a point on the user. And this is typically enacted with devices that have 3 degrees of freedom, so they can detect their orientation in the world, but not their position. Then we have the exocentric, grounded, or world-fixed content, and this is typically enacted by devices with this inside-out tracking, with 6 degrees of freedom, so they can detect their orientation and position changes. And yeah, this is particularly enabled by, a good example of this is the Oculus Quest, for example. You can see in these images here that we have different examples of exocentric content. In particular, in bottom left, we see a visualization of climbing Mount Everest that is attached to the desk in front of the user. So now we've got a bit of terminology and background about mixed reality displays. I'll talk about how these headsets can potentially affect how we engage in day-to-day computer-based productivity tasks. So this is my desk at work, back when we were still able to regularly go to our workplaces. And here I have multiple large displays that are effectively egocentrically oriented, but exocentrically positioned, as well as multiple devices and peripherals. And this is all intended to enable me to multitask more effectively. However, there are some problems with existing multi-monitor spaces like this. So first and foremost, perhaps, it represents a physical barrier to the world. It cuts me off from all the other people that are in my shared office. These displays are not easily adjustable or adaptable to a specific task. I am, as you can see, sorely limited as to how many physical displays I can have here. And they are ergonomically problematic, so they're difficult for me to position or reposition and reorient. There's no adaptation over time or based on my seating position changes or the changes in my posture. And obviously, this doesn't particularly travel well in terms of mobile usage. So then I have to revert back to a single display on a laptop. However, we're approaching a point where I think we're going to become less reliant on these physical displays. So we now have VR and AR headsets that are sufficiently capable of rendering virtual displays that are both wide and legible for the first time. And there have been numerous examples of this over the past few years, particularly in virtual reality use cases. So we have big screen, the application here, multi-screens. This was another kind of multi-display virtual workspace. Space, which partitioned this workspace into containers. Virtual desktop, which would allow for the mirroring of Windows desktops in your VR development environment. And perhaps most recently, Facebook's Infinite Office concept, where they were showing a wide virtual workspace that was rendered in an Oculus Quest headset. And in augmented reality, multiple projects have used devices like the Microsoft HoloLens to render virtual displays and content in mixed reality. For better or worse in this case, I leave that to be determined by you. Now, the benefits of virtual displays are that fundamentally we can manipulate virtual displays or applications in ways that are difficult to impossible to do with physical displays. And the question really is, what manipulations are worthwhile? So how will we manipulate these virtual display spaces? Is it for usability or enhanced ergonomics or enhanced efficiency? And there are a number of factors that we can now trivially manipulate with a virtual display. For example, its size, its shape, its orientation. So we can have flat displays, curved displays, they can conform to physical surfaces. They can potentially supplement or supplant existing physical displays. So if we have a mixed reality headset, these displays don't need to physically exist. Instead, they can be rendered virtually by my headset whenever I sit down at my desk, for example. The depth of the display can be manipulated, and the depth of the content on the display can also be manipulated. So this enables us to use depth to render 3D content on or around planar displays. In terms of placement, well, we can place these displays by whatever criteria we see fit. They could be placed exocentrically in the world. We could prioritize spatial constancy or visual saliency of the background in terms of where they're placed. So that leads to questions around what kinds of constraints or rules we should apply to virtual display placement. And even the number of displays or display elements that we have available can be manipulated. So there are no longer any meaningful restrictions on what we choose to call our workspace. So here you can see the user has a 3D spherical grid of displays that they're manipulating. Now, our focus has been on the ergonomics of wide virtual workspaces. So we know we can render multiple virtual displays around us, going up to and beyond what we might typically do in a physical workspace. We know that multiple displays benefit sense making and awareness. They enable spatial partitioning of subtasks and greater information density and availability. However, wide virtual workspaces have the potential to lead to excessive head or neck movement with content that's not easily or comfortably reachable. So this could lead to increased risk of musculoskeletal disorders. This might cause harm if used every day for hours at a time. But some variety of head motion is required. So, we know that dual monitor setups, for example, contribute beneficially to neck health. So, can we improve the usability of wide virtual workspaces and make it feasible to use them for, an everyday work experience? So our approach here has been to enact counter rotation of displays around a pivot point. The pivot point being the AR or VR user. So the intent here is that we exploit implicit inputs, so the head orientation changes of the user, to enact counter rotation of displays based on various different schemes that I'll show, with the end result being that you can access a wide display space in a much narrower range of head yaw motion. So across two studies, we explored how we can beneficially alter the mapping between head orientation and display position, and then whether this implicit control of display position based on head orientation is preferable to a user-enacted explicit control or no control at all. So our first study was looking at manipulating the mapping between head orientation and this wraparound virtual workspace position. So we were looking at two factors here. Firstly, the number of virtual displays that you have surrounding the user. So here we can see that we have each display encompassing a 60-degree range around the pivot point, that is where the user is placed. And we had either 3 displays constituting 180 degrees of display space, or 5 displays constituting 300 degrees of display space around the user. And then we had this mapping factor here. And so the mapping is referring to how the counter rotation is applied to our displays based on the current user's head orientation on the Y or yaw axis. So let's say that I want to look at a virtual display that is 90 degrees to my right on the yaw axis. In our baseline with no mapping, I would have to physically turn my head the full 90 degrees to view that content, which would not be particularly comfortable, and particularly if I have to keep my hands on the keyboard or mouse or other peripherals that I'm using. So we tried a variety of solutions here to reduce the amount of head movement necessary. So firstly, we looked at a constant counter-rotational gain. And what this meant is that if I turned my head for 10 degrees, there would be an equal counter rotation of the same amount applied to the virtual display space. For our 90-degree example, this meant that I could look at the same point on the virtual display with only 45 degrees of head movement instead. However, we also hypothesized that this constant counter rotation would not be particularly comfortable, given that there would be continuous movement and a kind of amplified perception of these displays subtly moving left or right based on small head movements. So we also proposed two potential fixes here. Firstly, having a central dead zone where no gain was applied, meaning that you would have peripheral displays intended for quick glance-based viewing, and secondly, to have a dead zone applied to the center of every display. So now I'll show you a clip of some of these solutions in action, so you can see the amount of head rotation in reality versus the pointing degrees on this wide display space now visible. So we can see the constant assistance condition here, where as I move my head to minus 60 degrees in reality, I'm perceiving the display that is actually at minus 120 degrees. The central dead zone condition, you can see I move my head left or right, the displays don't move. And then as I move my head left, the displays start to counter-rotate again. And then in this condition, we had the dead zones between every display. And the effect of that was basically to create this perception of the displays snapping into place based on the head orientation changes. So in a small-scale user study, 16 users watched a documentary while performing a targeting task. And we captured subjective neck fatigue, workload, simulator sickness, discomfort, and performance in this task. And I'll show an example of the task here, which we used to motivate transitions between the virtual displays and control the extent to which each display was viewed. So we'll see a prompt in a second telling the user to look to their left, and then they try to accurately select the target on the leftmost display, and then they move back to the right. So in this way, we could motivate transitions between these displays, but control the extent and magnitude of the transition. Now, we had a lot of measures here, but the quick summary is that there was minimal impact on accuracy, so people could effectively target these virtual displays. And the counter rotations made viewing the peripheral displays more comfortable, particularly compared to the absence of any assistance in viewing, and particularly for the 5 display space that we tested. And counter rotations, as we proposed them, were preferred. So particularly the instant transitions based on the display boundaries, and particularly for the 3 display configuration over the 5 display configuration. So as a kind of overview, we think that our instant transitions based on this head orientation change allowed users to effectively half the amount of head or neck movement required to access peripheral displays. So this led to improvements in terms of body movement, neck fatigue, discomfort, performance and selection time. However, our interview feedback suggested that the transition movements were at times too abrupt, and the size of the dead zones might not have been large enough. And there also remained a question of whether this implicit control based on your head orientation was the right choice versus explicit control, which we intended to follow up with in the next study that I'm going to talk about. So in study 2, we looked at implicit versus explicit control of a workspace. And in this study, we wanted to attain greater ecological validity. So we wanted to put people into a real functional virtual workspace with a real productivity task. We wanted to iterate on our boundary switching mechanism based on the feedback we received, and then explore the utility of this implicit control of display position versus explicit control. So for study 2, we iterated upon the best assistance technique, as I said, and implemented a fully functional virtual workspace. And this had 3 virtual Windows desktops, as well as a positionally tracked keyboard and mouse, allowing for equivalent interactivity to a standard non-VR workspace. And this used the Logitech mixed reality keyboard for text entry and an Apple trackpad for cursor control, both tracked and visible in VR. So participants performed this holiday planning task which motivated use of the full workspace. The first condition here was the fixed displays. This is when the displays did not move based on any actions from the user. Then we had this user control condition, which gave the users keyboard shortcuts for shifting the displays left or right, a bit like how a virtual desktop would work on a Windows or Apple laptop right now. And then in the third condition, we had our iteration of the best rank technique from study one. This allowed for implicit control based on the head movements of the user. So you can see here, I look left or right, and the displays counter-rotate to slot into place. Now, again, I'll just cover some very brief highlights in the results here. But broadly, in terms of the TLX performance, the boundary condition was preferred. In terms of user preferences, the majority of users ranked the boundary condition as preferred. And in terms of the viewing behavior, for the explicit control condition here, we can see that users use this functionality for approximately 35% of all the display transitions that they enacted. And this reaffirmed prior research that questioned the uptake of explicit mechanisms like this. So for 65% of the time, users would still effectively fall back on manually looking at the peripheral displays rather than using the keyboard shortcuts to enact these display changes. And that's something that's come up time and again in the literature, that if you give people this functionality, the adoption of that functionality will be highly variable. You can't depend on users to necessarily use this, and they may forget to use it. So over 2 studies, we demonstrated the utility of dynamically manipulating the display position based on head or neck movement. Wide display spaces were made more comfortable and more accessible to users, and that allowed their use within a more ergonomic envelope of neck movement. So virtual displays here, I think, give us an opportunity not just to present more content in terms of lots of varied 3D things that are flying around the user, but to present it in ways that also better take into account the ergonomics and the ability and range of motion of an individual, and adapt to changes in our context, our posture, our position, or any situational or permanent impairments that we have here. So I think this is a fairly unique benefit of virtual and augmented reality rendering these virtual displays as we move to them from existing physical displays. But I think this is also just scratching the surface in terms of what we can achieve here. So for direct follow-ups to our study, I think there is a number of refinements we could do to this dynamic manipulation of the display position. So firstly, we could improve the display boundary switching. So you may have noticed in the video there was at least one point where the displays kind of got stuck where I was looking in between them. So there's some false positive transitions that we were enacting here. And the technology we were using at the time didn't have any eye tracking capability. So this was all enacted based on head orientation rather than eye gaze. So there are some immediate benefits that we could probably enact there. In terms of things like cursor management, we used a cursor relocation gesture to move the cursor to where the user's head orientation intersected the virtual displays. But better approaches will be needed here as we render these larger, wider virtual workspaces. And we could also envisage alternative display arrangements and anchor points. So we only looked at horizontal curved displays of fixed sizes, but various works have hypothesized many other configurations might be suitable for different contexts. So, for example, you could have virtual displays that were vertically oriented or stacked, or you could have varied 2D or 3D configurations of virtual content. How can we make different configurations equally, if not more so, accessible? There's also the potential to directly influence posture. So in the typical case right now, the user has to consciously monitor and modify their posture, trying to avoid the scenario on the left here and prioritize a posture like the one on the right. But in a virtual workspace with the right sensing, so for example, an IMU on the neck, or even just using the very accurate tracking of the headset to determine changes in position or height relative to a target position, we could theoretically detect this posture through the AR or VR headset. If we can detect it, then we can modify the position of virtual displays relative to the user to encourage better posture. So, for example, what if the virtual displays temporarily moved closer to the user, forcing the user to lean back, and then slowly, perhaps near imperceptibly, those displays then returned to their default position once this was accomplished. In this way, we could hypothesize that we might better enforce good posture by manipulating the position and consequently the visibility of the display space. And I think there's a lot of potential for such an approach in the future. There are bound to be a number of manipulations that we can enact here that might lead to a better posture or provoke a better posture over time. And then there are also other applications of manipulating this display to body mapping that we were toying with here. So imagine a wrist-based augmented reality display where wrist rotation dictates which display is currently centered on the wrist for touch interaction. So low effort, small body movements could be utilized here to make virtual UIs more accessible. And then we have potential situational impairments to deal with. So imagine the use of such a workspace in a confined space, for example, an airplane. We have impairments such as limited neck, head, and torso movement, limited access to physical displays, obviously. The size of the displays that you're interacting with are typically restricted because you'll be looking at a tablet or a laptop or that kind of thing. And their ability to be repositioned is limited. So I think in such a scenario, there are particular benefits to being able to have virtual displays that are not hindered by the physical constraints of the environment that you're in. And indeed, we've started to look at the challenges of interacting with virtual workspaces in constrained spaces as part of our ERC project called Viajero, which is all around passenger experiences for augmented and virtual reality. So for example, in this study, we put people into virtual replicas of airplane environments, and we got them to interact with different virtual display configurations in a holiday planning task. And we examined the social acceptability and attitudes toward different horizontal, mixed, and vertical arrangements of displays. And we found that preferences here were stronger toward the vertical arrangement of displays, despite our previous focus on the horizontal arrangements. And that was despite the potential for decreased comfort here. The motivator seemed to be the perceived social acceptability of looking in the direction of other people and their seatbacks, which motivated this choice to move to the vertical arrangement. In a follow-up study, we then put people into a number of different VR travel environments. So replicating real-world contexts and asking participants to propose how they would want to spatially arrange a given set of virtual displays for future augmented reality use. So we examined this across 4 virtual recreations of common shared and social passenger contexts. So this was airplane, car, subway, and train. And we did so across 3 different numbers of virtual displays. So looking at 1 display, 3 displays, or 5 displays, exploring user attitudes, their strategies toward display placement, and the likelihood of use of these configurations, all in a virtual reality simulated passenger environment. So this is where we're using virtual reality as a means to prototype and explore future augmented reality experiences. Now, I'm just going to show some examples of the most extreme conditions here. So this is where we asked participants to lay out 5 virtual displays in each of these contexts. But we've already seen some quite different strategies between those that use these virtual displays as a barrier to occlude other passengers, or those that prioritize their comfort and usability over social acceptability concerns. So here, this user, given the 5 displays for entertainment usage, chose to effectively block out the entire row of people that was opposite to them. So that they could focus on the content with the maximal comfort. Um, However, that strategy is not universal here. So in this case, this user tried to adapt their virtual display arrangement to the social context they were in. So here they were avoiding occlusion or creating the perception of staring at other people by placing displays either below or above the other people in this virtual travel environment that were across from them. Here in this train environment, this person found it acceptable and preferable to orient their display space vertically, given the freedom of augmented reality. So again, they were occluding the people across from them in this train environment and preferring to prioritize their display arrangement effectively. Whereas this person, again, was trying to avoid inclusion of other passengers. So they were using all the existing surfaces that would not lead to them being perceived as looking at the other passengers, for example. In the plane, we found similar habits. So for some people, having content that's oriented on the seat backs that are perceived to belong to other passengers is acceptable. For others, far less so. So we aggregated the display layout preferences that people indicated in these heat maps pictured here. And this is where we asked users to indicate in pictures for each scene where they would not want virtual display content to be positioned. So brighter areas here are where they would not want to place virtual display content. For example, in this picture, we can see the average negative preferences regarding where they did not want to place virtual displays or content. And this neatly illustrates why passenger contexts in particular are a challenge. So, despite the complete freedom to render this virtual content wherever they wish, here you can see that with the absence of color around the table, that participants preferred to place the virtual content low down on the table, effectively mimicking what we already do with laptops and tablets. So, avoiding placing content in the more comfortable, but perhaps more socially unacceptable eye line of other passengers. Conversely, in the subway example, we saw a significant number of users employ their virtual content as a means of shielding themselves from the sight of other passengers, with users focusing on placing their virtual displays directly in front of their view. So one potential theory here is that for shorter duration journeys, this appears to be a more acceptable strategy to our users. So for simulated travel contexts, despite the ergonomic possibilities offered by virtual content and displays, the social pressure and the affordances of the physical travel environment would nonetheless lead some users to employ perhaps less comfortable or arguably less optimal configurations in terms of how they lay out their virtual productivity workspace. So the challenge here is subtly different as there's an additional constraint. How can we make socially acceptable display configurations more ergonomic to use? Now, this could include applying our suggested approaches to vertical arrangements of content. You could easily imagine doing a similar counter-rotation approach based on the pitch of the headset, for example. Or we might need to carefully motivate some variety of neck and head movements here. So avoiding the typical long periods of fixating on a real seat back display that is, small and very close to the user. So, in summary, there are a number of potential benefits for virtual and augmented reality for productivity. So, firstly, our focus has been on the ergonomics and the usability here. You can have unlimited, wide, tall, dynamic, adjustable virtual workspace layouts that operate within the usable envelope of head, neck, and body movement. And these could potentially adapt to different envelopes of movement based on situational or permanent impairments. So the key example there would be in the airplane, for example, where you might be quite restricted in how much movement you can enact, but you do still want to get the benefit of having this rich, complex virtual workspace for productivity on a long-haul flight, for example. There's also mobility considerations. So with a VR or AR workspace that is enacted by your personal headset or personal AR glasses, that workspace can travel with you and it can adapt to the physical environment that you're in. And in terms of physical infrastructure, well, if we can do away with the presence of multiple large physical displays, then we will have lower energy usage and consequently heat emissions. This might be beneficial for large or shared offices. Um, Removing this physical infrastructure of real physical displays also has the benefit of removing these physical barriers of walls of displays in shared offices, erecting these virtual barriers to your view of others only when necessary. And I think this could be a particular benefit for home working. So I know that some people have really struggled with the transition back to home life after the working day, especially when the artifacts of all your working life are still present in the physical environment. So for home working, you can imagine that your office can, at least in part, recede into the background at the end of the day. So, if the virtual displays disappear, if the virtual calendar on the wall disappears at the end of the working day, you'd be left with only a few physical artifacts or reminders that you were using that space for your work, the keyboard or mouse. Artifacts that arguably could be trivially removed or hidden or put away in a drawer. So in that way, I think there's a real possibility that we can provide people with performant, usable virtual workspaces that also don't take over their homes in a kind of permanent sense. And in terms of the environment, so we can augment or supplant reality with virtual content that might even create a more calming or enjoyable office. So this could be particularly potentially beneficial for open plan offices or working at home. You can imagine the AR headset, for example, rendering a virtual window to your garden, or have your work-related augmentations, as I was saying, disappear from your home at the end of the day. Some people have been looking particularly at the virtual reality workspaces for this particular benefit, because as I've said, virtual reality in particular has this capability to immerse you in a completely different world. So how would this work if you were to put on a VR headset and work in a completely different environment? Would it improve your productivity? Would it improve your mental health and well-being? There's open questions here about how we'll use these technologies in the future, but I think there are some potential benefits. I realize that some people may look at that and think it's a rather dystopian vision of the future if you put on a VR headset to work, but nonetheless, I think there are some benefits that merit exploration. And then in terms of communication and collaboration, if we're using augmented or virtual reality headsets, we're one step closer to facilitating embodied 3D telepresent communications and collaboration around 3D artifacts. So these are kind of side benefits of if we transition to these technologies for everyday productivity, that they will also have the potential to enhance how we communicate and collaborate with other people remotely, which is particularly pertinent these days given our reliance on WebEx and Zoom and all these other video conferencing platforms, for example. And there are also benefits in terms of the personal sensing that is contained within these headsets. So, as I said earlier, these headsets have the potential to detect posture. We can capture EEG and EMG data, physiological data, eye tracking, and so on. So there's lots of possibilities here in terms of potentially better monitoring cognitive load or stress, or detecting when mistakes are made in your work, and then having some kind of application or system intervene in these cases. And in terms of interaction, so I work in human-computer interaction. This is a particular benefit that I like here. XR headsets can also sense, track, and augment the physical environment and the objects that are in it. So, for example, we could support the augmentation of physical keyboards. Now you can see that in the image on the right here. This is another project we had with Logitech, where they had this tracked keyboard, and we were looking at how we would augment or overwrite the functionality that's displayed on each key here. So here you can see there's kind of emoji input available. But you can also augment and track the user's body. So, we can have a workspace which can dynamically incorporate things like hand-tracked mid-air interactions. Now, so far, this has all been very kind of future looking. And so the one overarching question here is, when will this actually impact practice? And really, this is contingent on hardware advances as pushed by Facebook, Apple, Google, Microsoft, HTC, the numerous companies that are working on VR and AR headsets right now. So some of the headsets that I most commonly refer to here are the Microsoft HoloLens 2. So that's a headset that costs in the region of $3,000 right now. It has a limited field of view. We're talking 50 degrees or so. They're not particularly fashionable yet. As I said, they're quite expensive. So as an AR headset, whilst it is showing us the possibilities enabled here, we are still some way off having an AR headset that would meet that everyday consumer reality. For Facebook, the same thing with VR headsets with the Oculus Quest 2. So the Quest 2 is relatively affordable. It's around $300 or so, but not particularly comfortable for long periods of usage. It's rather heavy still. The resolution, the fidelity, the field of view, it's not quite there yet. Frankly, that form of headset is not one that I would be wanting to wear for the duration of a full workday. Really, right now, these headsets are only suited for use for maybe an hour or two at a time before it will start to get a bit too warm, a bit too uncomfortable. So we are waiting on advances here in terms of optics, resolution, field of view, the form factor of the headsets, their comfort, and their price. Now, it's my view that it's inevitable that we'll get there. So when Apple, for example, are heavily rumored to have an AR, VR headset by 2022 and glasses by 2025, when Microsoft are talking about their HoloLens 3, when Facebook are talking about their Oculus Quest 2 Pro, you can see that these headsets are rapidly advancing year on year. And they're still profitable. So I think it's inevitable that we will have headsets that can enact some of the things that I presented here today. So my argument here is that we need to be in a position to take full advantage of these technologies when they mature and become available. So right now we're working with, prototyping these experiences in VR headsets, or we're using AR headsets that are some way off the capabilities we might imagine. But if we can do the groundwork now, then when these headsets are ready to be put into everyday use, and that might be in 5 years' time, that might be in 10 years' time. It's very hard to guess when. But when this happens, hopefully we will have enough groundwork there to know how we can take best advantage of them for benefiting ergonomics and mobile productivity and all the other challenges that I've listed here. So that concludes this talk on mixed reality and productivity. So thanks everyone for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions now.
Thank you so much, Mark, for this thought-provoking, futuristic, and exciting presentation. It sparked a lot of questions, so we'll jump right in and hopefully we'll get through as many as we can.
Sure thing.
All right. Has there been any research done on the prolonged usage of VR and eye health?
Oh, that's an interesting one. So I would be surprised if that hasn't been the case. Now, one of the problems with VR technology in general is that it is going through rapid advancement. So I would be amazed if you were to go into Google Scholar and search for VR and eye health if there haven't been studies on previous Oculus headsets or even in previous eras of VR technology. But one of the issues here is that the optics, the display technology, the form factors are all rapidly advancing, even in terms of the lenses that they use in these headsets, or the way by which they project light into your eye, depending on if you're using an AR headset, for example. Um, so I don't think there's likely to be any one piece of research out there that could state definitively what effect VR would have on eye health. Now, there are potential issues in terms of the depth of the content and the depth of the display that you're trying to focus on. Um, but these issues may only apply to VR headsets more than for augmented reality see-through headsets. So, there's an
Thanks.
interesting question there, which is if we did adopt this technology, would we all suffer all kinds of horrible eye problems multiple years down the line from that? Um, and I think the answer there is that we're not quite sure yet. My hunch would be that augmented reality would probably be quite safe depending on the optics that are used there, but we may find that more occlusive virtual reality, we might have to instigate usage limits there. So that's kind of why I
Thanks.
emphasize augmented reality as a particular, route forward for augmented productivity in particular.
Thanks, Mark. And there's quite a few questions related to the physical consequences. And I don't mean that in a negative way. So we've had questions related to vertigo.
Mm.
And again, as you've said, there's probably, ongoing research around that as we move forward. One of the questions related to even automation of cars um, is the age range of study subjects. So we're seeing that the younger generation appears to be more open to giving up control and letting a car, for instance, drive itself, whereas our older users who haven't had that experience aren't as comfortable with that. Was there an age range of study subjects related to those differences, and what were the age ranges of your subjects?
So for our studies, typically it's going to be drawing from student populations. So we are incredibly poor, I would say, at accommodating um, sufficient age range in the demographics of what we're looking at. So that's the practicality of running small scale usability studies, really. If anyone wants to fund a large scale study where I can recruit older adults as well, I'd be happy to do so. But yeah, that is an important limitation there, and it's a limitation in terms of the um, acceptance of these technologies. But then there are also limitations in terms of the degradation of eyesight in older
Exactly.
adults. As I am well aware, my glasses prescription would attest to that already. Um, so I think those are all valid concerns there. And I'm sure that if we go into the near future, if let's say Apple come out with an AR headset, an AR pair of glasses, then younger adults will probably be amongst the first to adopt that kind of technology. Um, so I would agree that we do need to look at the age-related effects there. Um, we haven't done that yet. So for all of the studies I've talked about, it was all age ranges were probably in between 18 to 30 roughly, so kind of younger adults.
Thanks, Mark. And as you're aware, and hopefully all of our participants are aware, that CRE-MSD does have seed grants available and rapid response grants. So there might be an opportunity to chunk out pieces to look at variables related to age and MSDs and different approaches and coping strategies. So
Yeah, I think
something
that'd
to
be a
think
great
about.
line of research to pursue. Yeah.
All right, so we have a question related to the potential for the VR headset to sense side-to-side eye movement instead of head turning.
Hmm.
Potentially that would decrease neck stresses. Was there anything that you discovered in that realm?
So, I mean, that's an area that we really want to follow up on. So the headsets that we used in these studies were conducted in 2018, 2019, roughly now. So the research is a couple of years old. At the time, we didn't have any good VR headsets with inbuilt eye tracking technology. You could get Tobii trackers that you could fit to VR headsets, but they were rather expensive. Now, we literally just this week, I've got hold of some VR headsets with integrated eye tracking there. Um, so I think that's a very insightful question. The using head orientation as a proxy for gaze is not ideal. That's what we did pragmatically in order to test these solutions out. But I think that if you have eye tracking, then obviously you can tell what virtual display someone is attending to in a much more direct sense. And if you know that, you can react to that as an implicit input. And that would map not just to these counter rotations of displays, but also potentially manipulating the scale of the display. So one of the concepts we've talked about a lot would be that you can minimize the size of some of these displays until you look at them. And when we know that you're looking at them, we might then expand the display out and give you a more detailed view of the content. And that's an adaptation you can't do with physical monitors right now. And I think there'll be a number of adaptations like that as we get more toward um, capable high resolution VR and AR headsets with sensing like gaze tracking.
Thanks, Mark. Could multi-finger swipe functions improve the ease of switching between screens rather than using a hotkey?
That's another one that I agree with entirely. I've got a student project right now doing just that. The student has a multi-touch tablet surface, and they're looking at devising control schemes for manipulating these virtual workspaces. I imagine the person asking that question is a power user of Windows or Apple devices. They commonly have multi-touch gestures to enact different control schemes for virtual desktops, for example. Um, but I think the key thing that I would refer to in terms of the explicit use of control schemes to manipulate the virtual workspace is that there is a reasonable amount of evidence that people will default to physically managing or their viewing of that workspace. They will either forget to use that functionality, or they will only infrequently use that functionality. And their fallback is then that they have to physically access these virtual displays. So if we have a really wide virtual display space where, let's say 30, 40, 50% of the time, they don't use the user interface and interactions that we've defined to enable them to browse it, they will fall back to physically looking at these displays, and that becomes problematic when we have super wide virtual workspaces. So I think we can definitely provide better control schemes, but my suspicion is that really we need strong implicit mechanisms for gauging which display you're attending to so that we can dynamically make these adaptations in a way that they always consistently happen and that users can't fall back into bad habits.
Thanks so much, Mark. I'm thinking about my bad habits and how this futuristic technology might help that. Um, a comment and a question. The comment is, could you provide some information related to dual monitor setups benefiting neck health? And you might have encountered some of that. And then also the impact of wearing glasses. So
Mhm.
I'll let you attempt those two.
So for the benefits of dual monitor usage, there's a citation in the paper that we published, which has the same name as this talk, coincidentally. So it'll be easy enough to find. It was published in ACM Tokai, and there are some references in there about the benefits of dual monitors. Um, as I recall, one of the primary benefits was that you wouldn't be fixating on one particular viewpoint for a long period of time. So if you have two monitors, then depending on the task that you're conducting, you'll be periodically switching between them left and right. And that small variation in head and neck movement can be beneficial to preventing issues from arising. For the second question around the impact of glasses and VR headsets, yeah, VR headsets are not yet ideal for glasses wearers. Now, some companies are providing the ability to customize the lenses in these VR headsets so that you can get prescription lenses. Um, and then, depending on the display technology you're using, for augmented reality, you can get the same thing, or it might not be an issue. It depends really on the optics and the the means of rendering the virtual content that each headset employs, and there's a lot of variety there. So as a glasses wearer myself, I can say that right now and AR headsets are not brilliant for us, but the future is looking a bit better in that respect.
Okay, Mark, this last question is maybe a bit of a stretch, but you might have encountered some research or been involved in this with your studies. Are you aware of research on memory and retention of information in VR and AR?
I think that's beyond my ballpark, really.
That's, yeah,
Aware of in the
I just
sense
thought
that I'm
we'd
pretty
throw it out
sure.
there.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I've seen papers on, designing virtual environments that would, or augmented reality, augmentations of reality that can benefit memory. But offhand, I couldn't help there except to say that I'm sure that some research in that direction exists.
Thank you. Not so much related to MSDs, but we thought we would just end with that. Thank you so much for this really engaging talk, and we encourage everyone to join us on November 17th for another webinar in this series. Have a great rest of the day, everyone. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, everyone.